My name is Janice Chow, and I am a science teacher. I currently teach middle school students at the UCLA Community School at RFK in Koreatown. I'm a graduate of the UCLA TEP program, and I have partnered with TEP student teachers in my classroom for the last 4 years. One of the most consistent comments I've heard from these new teachers over the years is the helpfulness of learning how to lesson plan and plan entire units of study together. Of course, there are many different ways to lesson plan, and different teachers have different styles of organizing learning experiences, so there's no, quote, one right way to do this. But today, the classroom practice I will be sharing is a quick overview of how I personally unit plan, especially focusing on building multilingualism and practicing translanguaging in the classroom. Okay, so 2 things to start with. First, unit planning is not just planning a sequence of lessons to accomplish learning content standards. A strong unit plan considers not only meaningful learning experiences for students, but also serves as a grounding space of intentional goals for content, skills, language development, connections to the community, and calls to participate in social action. There are lots of resources out there around backwards planning and YPAR. Today, I'm just going to briefly share how I synthesize a bunch of planning models in my science classroom and in interdisciplinary projects. Second, what is translanguaging? I don't claim to be an expert on this by any means, but a really brief and incomplete explanation. It's a cognitive sociocultural theory of language and bilingualism that is rooted in the point of view of the bilingual speaker and communities. It grounds learning in the reality that people who know more than one language can use many avenues of linguistic expression, which should be encouraged and nurtured in the classroom. This looks like using any and all languages to learn and to express. Traditionally, we view bilingualism through a lens of separation. For example, I go to Chinese class and then I have English classes. They're separate. Other traditional bilingual models view language as interconnected, where different languages have some overlap, but translanguaging is about integration. It is centered not on the languages themselves, but the practices of bilinguals and the people who use the language. It's more than just code switching, which is seen as alternating languages. For example, if I know how to say what I want to say in Korean, or if I want to write in Bangla, or relate a story I was told in K'iche', translanguaging theory says that not only should this be encouraged, even if I'm not in Korean class or whatever, but that this should be strategically and actively fostered. Translanguaging provides support for comprehending content, engaging in language practice within content, creating space to develop bilingualism, and promoting socio-emotional development of students. There are so many resources out there to learn more about translanguaging if you want to learn more. Our school was basing our PDs from a book called The Translanguaging Classroom by Ofelia Garcia, Susanna Ibarra Johnson, and Kate Seltzer. Okay, so that sounds great. How do I lesson plan for a multilingual classroom? Adapting from Understanding by Design's backwards planning model, I start with a topic at hand. This might be standards-driven, or it could start from an interdisciplinary or community-based issue. Then I move into the big picture for the unit. What are the driving essential questions? What enduring understandings do I want my students to remember 10 years down the line? What is the framework and narrative of social justice, ethnic studies, and equity here? That leads to what social action students will be working towards in this unit, which then necessitates defining what the language goals are for the unit. How will language be used? Where are opportunities for multilingualism, both in the classroom and also in their lived experiences outside of the classroom? What vocabulary do students need in both English and their home languages? What scaffolds do we need to support conversation, dialogue, interviewing or surveying skills, etc., among their peers and with their communities? From there, I go into more specifics about activities and how concepts can be scaffolded to guide students through understanding complex ideas and designing real solutions. The unit plan process ends with fleshing out individual lesson plans and reflecting along the way as the unit unfolds. Okay, So here are some examples of unit plans that I have created and used in my middle school science classroom. I will be honest, these are legit copy-pasted text from the lesson plans I actually used, so you will see my process is not 100% linear or line by line of what I just showed you, but the elements are all there. That also means I'm not going to read every line of these plans because some things were really specific to my school site or to the interdisciplinary route I was taking with my social studies colleague, but this document will be made available to you if you want to look more closely or more slowly. Okay, this first example here is from my 8th grade physical science class, though it has earth science connections as well. We're learning about forces and earthquakes because I used to teach a forces unit within the physics part of my 8th grade science class, and the project we used to do was around car safety and inertia. But with all of the earthquakes that have been happening in California, particularly the back-to-back huge earthquakes in LA last summer, I ventured to try something different this year, especially knowing working class communities, communities of color, and poor people statistically suffer more from natural disaster than other demographics. So here we have all of the big picture things, starting with the essential questions. And you'll notice that these essential questions are vague on purpose. They're very general and not talking specifically about science because they are meant to be paired in an interdisciplinary unit with history and social studies, which is why there's this list here of what the history class was going through in this unit at the same time. We have our enduring understandings of change as well as science specific. Then I went into the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards, to pull content objectives and performance expectations that matched the topic that we were using. So we have a physical science standard here as well as an earth science standard. And then we get into the language objectives. So for this particular unit, the language, multilingual, translanguaging objective is, in order to create space for multilingualism and different ways of knowing, students will prepare an expository teaching tool about earthquake safety for a bilingual audience. So these were details around our particular project. And to be more specific here, what exactly were students doing that ties into the social action piece. So students will create one of the following projects to present to their families during winter break. Students also engaged in a self-reflection piece about this project and about their identities as bilingual people and as activists. The choice that they had for the social action project fell under two options here. The first one is to create an emergency preparedness plan, as well as some type of community teaching tool, for example, a bilingual leaflet or a bilingual presentation to be shared with some specified audience. They could choose to present to their families during the holidays or the winter break, or they could choose to create something that they would put on social media to share with their peers. And then we were also open to other ideas that students might have. The other option that they had was to write a formal letter or to create some sort of petition for their apartment landlords regarding building codes around earthquake safety, tenants' rights to live in a safe place, etc. And this tied specifically to an activity we did in science class around literally having the students look up their address in a state database to see if their place of residence was up to code with the retrofitting laws, and that we were learning about the engineering of retrofitting and what it means to live in a soft-story building and why those are more susceptible. And so if they found that their buildings were not up to code, this was a bilingual and legal route that they could have taken to advocate for change. Then I went into more specific activity ideas and flow, and then I went back, and you'll see here highlighted in red, I went back to highlight what are some possible spaces where multilingualism could specifically be built into the activities. So that included when we started off the unit, talking about their own personal experiences of the earthquake. They could choose whatever language to be writing or to be writing in, or they could use a different language when they were gathering resources from their community or from their home. We had a bunch of different activities throughout the unit where they were interviewing people or polling people to engage in conversations around building safety and earthquake preparedness. And then, of course, once the project started getting off the ground, we also had space for multilingualism to be built in there, specifically thinking about what language they were going to be using, depending on the audience that they were going to be sharing this information with. So I'm not going to get into the more personal breakdown here of the unit because I want to talk about another example from life science. This was a unit that we did at the end of 8th grade. This was the 8th grade students' culminating project at the end of their middle school careers, thinking back on their identity. The science connection in this interdisciplinary project was about anthropology, so the study of humans. And so from here, we actually started with the NGSS first, pulling a bunch of standards around evolution, also around ecosystems, also around environmental and genetic factors. The essential questions, again, are not science-specific because these spanned not just science class, but also history and English as well. So again, big picture understandings. What do we want students to really walk away with? The social justice framework here. The assessment was to create a trifold poster, again, worked on in multiple classes that had different artifacts on here that were going to be presented to their families during the actual 8th grade culmination ceremony. And so we have the instructions in both English and Spanish and listing out what were the different elements that they had to include. So from here, the multilingual or translanguaging objective was, in order to support students' socio-emotional development of bilingual identities, students will share stories about how scientists and engineers of color have presented and continue to present revolutionary ideas that changed our understanding of how the world works. We do this by curating bilingual resources as we were reading and writing, bilingual interview questions when they were engaging with community members around their STEAM identities, and on the teacher's end, being very specific about how we grouped students. So we actually put students in specific teams based off of their language choices so that when they were engaging in small group discussion and doing their final presentations, they could talk with people who shared similar home languages. So again, we have a lot more specifics here around than what happens in the unit. And again, this document will be made available to you if you wanted to read in more detail. But I'm going to go back to the slides, and we're going to end on a really practical note here. There are many opportunities for translanguaging within a unit plan, from the sequence of lessons we teach all the way to the assessments that we give. The general format I use to write these language objectives is outlined here. So you think about the unit you are implementing right now or planning for the future. Then think about an activity, task, strategy, culminating product, or assessment. Then align it with one of these purple or pink purposes of translanguaging. And finally, we're going to turn it into a translanguaging objective using the sentence frame down here. In order to do one of these things here, students will be able to, and then you fill in a language practice or task, and then combine it with a translanguaging strategy to promote the use of any and all linguistic abilities a student has in their repertoire. Here are some more examples of translanguaging objectives. The translanguaging purposes are highlighted in pink or purple, as we saw on the previous slide, and they are paired with a language practice or task in yellow. These yellow parts we're familiar with as teachers of English learners, and you can incorporate ELD best practices here. And in italics is a specific strategy for how students will draw from language expertise, whether it be dictionaries and translation apps or their own family members. And finally, I will leave you with some reflection questions to apply to your own practice. First, what can change tomorrow about how I teach to support language development? Second, what can change in my next unit or lesson to support translanguaging as a tool for language development, or support students' self-awareness of how they use language, or to co-create a culture of multilingual space, because if students don't feel comfortable or safe to speak a language other than English, they're not going to. And so That's a whole nother thing that can be talked about there. But I hope you found this video helpful, and obviously this is a very expansive topic that I'm still learning more about all the time and have not yet perfected, whatever that means. I wish you much learning, collaboration, and liberation in your own translanguaging journey. Thank you.